On a Sunday morning in October, Daniel Reyes handed over $80 at a scrapyard and towed home a motorcycle that looked like it had been buried and dug back up. The tank was dented, the chrome had gone to rust orange, and the engine casing was cracked clean through. His neighbor, Renee Foster, stood on her porch with a mug of tea and called out loud enough for 3 houses to hear, "You just spent your daughter's lunch money on a pile of scrap." Daniel didn't answer. He looked at the bike and started walking it toward his garage. 6 days later, a man who had spent 40 years building racing engines pulled up in a car worth more than Daniel's house and offered him $4 million. What had he actually found? Stay with this. The answer surprised everyone on the street, including Daniel. Daniel Reyes was 31, and his days had a shape that never varied. Up at 5:30, coffee in a chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Dad." A glance at the chalkboard calendar in the kitchen where his daughter Mabel had drawn a small sun next to every day she liked. He ran a one-man motorcycle repair business out of the detached garage behind his rented house, the kind of operation that survived on referrals and the fact that he never overcharged anyone. His wife Priya had died 18 months earlier. Aneurysm, no warning, a Tuesday like any other Tuesday. The life insurance had covered the funeral and not much else, because Priya had let the policy lapse the year before without either of them noticing until it was too late to matter. Daniel didn't talk about her much. When Mabel asked questions, he answered them honestly and completely, but he never brought her up first. Grief, for him, had become something structural, not a wound he tended, but a beam that had been added to the frame of the house he was. Mabel was 6, had a gap where her top front tooth used to be, and carried around a small stuffed fox with one ear chewed soft from years of sleeping with it pressed against her cheek. Priya had named the fox Ember the week Mabel was born, because Priya had grown up around dirt track racing and loved the particular orange of a fire that's about to catch. The fox had been resown twice. Mabel didn't care. 2 doors down lived Nate Ferris, 42, who ran the only other repair shop on the block and had known Daniel since they were teenagers stripping down mopeds in his father's driveway. Nate had the rare talent of knowing exactly when a person needed a joke and when they needed silence, and he deployed both with precision. On Sunday afternoons, he brought over leftover barbecue, and the 2 men would eat sitting on overturned crates while Mabel colored at the workbench. Nate was the only adult Mabel called by his first name without anyone correcting her. Renee Foster had moved onto the street 14 months earlier. Her house had a red door, an SUV parked at an angle so precise it looked surveyed, and a lawn that never had a blade out of place. She was 29, sold high-end real estate 2 towns over, and had a way of saying exactly what she thought the instant she thought it, with no interval in between. She wasn't malicious. She simply hadn't developed the habit most people have of holding a sentence for a second before releasing it. She and Daniel had spoken maybe 30 times in over a year, mostly in passing. Once she'd told him, with a smile that was almost kind, that a starter home street like this one was probably not where you want to raise a kid long term. He'd nodded once and gone back inside. She thought he was standoffish. He thought the conversation had ended exactly where it needed to. Willow Street was a place where news moved on its own schedule, faster than logic allowed. Fences were low, porches faced porches, and dogs got walked slowly enough that anyone with something to say had time to say it. Gordon Pace had run Pace Salvage for going on 25 years, out past the rail yard, behind a chain-link fence with a gap in it that everyone used instead of the gate. He was 64, didn't believe in appraisals, and priced things by squinting at them. The Sunday Daniel came in for a set of brake calipers for a regular customer. Gordon was in the middle of clearing out a horde of vehicles that had come from an estate liquidation, a private collector who died with no heirs interested in motorcycles, and a bank that wanted the storage unit empty by the 15th. Daniel was walking the back fence line when he saw it, half under a collapsed lean-to that had been rained on so many times the corrugated tin had gone the color of a dead leaf. The frame was low and long in a way that didn't match any factory bike he recognized. The tank had a taper to it that seemed hand-formed rather than stamped, and the rear subframe kicked up at an angle he'd only ever seen on purpose-built race machines, never on anything meant for a showroom. He crouched down and ran a thumb along the weld seam at the frame's backbone. It wasn't factory. Factory welds have a rhythm to them, a repetition, because a machine or a board line worker made 1,000 just like it. This weld had been laid by hand, by someone who'd stopped and looked and adjusted before laying the next bead. He'd been rebuilding engines since he was 9 years old in his uncle's shop. He knew the difference the way you know a voice on the phone before the person says their name. Gordon ambled over, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since stopped being useful for wiping anything. That one's $80. I want it gone by tonight, or it's getting crushed with the rest of the row tomorrow. Daniel thought about Mabel's shoes, which had a hole starting at the left big toe and had for 3 weeks because there hadn't been a spare $50 at the right moment. He thought about the water heater that needed replacing. He thought that he had no defensible reason to be standing here with his hand on a dead engine case, and he paid the $80 anyway. When he tipped the bike onto its side to check the undercarriage, something small and stiff fluttered out from behind the number plate bracket and landed in the gravel. A fragment of a decal, most of its adhesive long gone. He picked it up without really looking and put it in his jacket pocket. He'd look later. He didn't know why it mattered. It did. The tow home was undignified. The bike roped into the bed of Nate's truck at an angle that made both of them wince every time they hit a pothole. They rolled onto Willow Street a little after 11 that morning, and by the time they reached Daniel's driveway, there were at least 5 people finding reasons to be outside. A woman across the street found something urgent to do with her mailbox. 2 boys on scooters stopped completely. Renee was at her fence line, and Daniel was fairly sure she hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. He heard her laugh, short and involuntary, before she caught it. He heard her say, not quite under her breath, "That poor girl." The words didn't land on him. They landed near Mabel, who'd come out onto the porch in her socks when she heard the truck. Daniel didn't turn around. He set the parking brake and said to his daughter, "Go grab my ratchet set from the kitchen, the red one." Mabel looked at Renee for exactly 1 second. Not angry, something more careful than angry. Then looked at the wrecked bike with her head tilted the way her father tilted his when he was listening for something under a hood. Then she went inside. Daniel unhooked the tie-downs without hurrying and without performing calm for the benefit of an audience. He simply was calm, in the particular way of a man who has already survived something much larger than a neighbor's opinion. That night, after Mabel was asleep, he went to work. 2 clip lights, the little radio that lived on the shelf between his torque wrenches, and the slow, bottom-up process he applied to everything he didn't understand yet. He scrubbed the frame down near the steering head, and under decades of grime, stamped into the metal, was a serial sequence that didn't match any format he'd ever cross-referenced. 7 characters, starting with the letters V, K, and R, followed by a run of numbers that meant nothing to any database he could find in 40 minutes of searching. He texted Nate a photo. "Ever seen a prefix like this? VKR?" Nate wrote back 11 minutes later. "Nope. Sleep." Daniel did not sleep. He took the decal fragment out of his pocket and held it under the light. Most of it had disintegrated, but what remained was the edge of a logo, a stylized hawk in mid-dive, rendered in hard, confident lines that had clearly been designed by someone who cared, not slapped on to decorate a commuter bike. He taped the fragment to a sheet of paper and went inside. Nate showed up before 7 the next morning because Daniel had called at 6:15 and said only, "Come look at something." Nate got down on the creeper under the frame and stayed there without a word for almost 5 minutes. When he slid back out, his face had settled somewhere between professional worry and poorly hidden excitement. "The frame's gusseted at every stress point," he said. "By hand. That's not a repair job, that's an engineering decision. Somebody spent real money and real time on this." He walked to the front and peered into the cracked engine case. "This isn't a stock cylinder bore either. It's been sleeved and machined to a spec that doesn't exist in any parts catalog I know." Daniel had already photographed the suspension linkage. The geometry was wrong for a street bike. Wrong in the specific way that only makes sense if you're chasing lap times on a closed course. The springs weren't off any shelf either. They'd been custom wound. That afternoon he found an old, text-heavy forum for vintage racing machines, the kind with a font from 2003 and members who'd been using the same username since dial-up. He posted the serial number, the frame photos, the suspension geometry, and the decal fragment, and asked, plainly, if anyone recognized any of it. By morning there were 61 replies. Most guessed it was an elaborate garage-built special from the late 1970s, somebody's ambitious weekend project cobbled together from race catalog parts. Three members who identified themselves as motorsport historians were less casual about it. One, posting as Deadstock_Dave, wrote, "If that serial is real, you're holding something that three people I know have been looking for since the Reagan administration." Another sent a private message, "Take the photos down. I mean it." That evening, Mabel came into the garage after dinner and took her usual seat, an overturned 5-gallon bucket, with Ember tucked under one arm. She watched her father polish a section of tank for a while before she asked, "Does it have a name?" He thought about it. "Not yet. You want to give it one?" She studied the bike the way she'd studied it in the driveway, head tilted, like the answer lived in the shape of the thing rather than in any word for it. After a moment, she said, "Ember." Daniel set down the cloth. He was quiet for a second. "That's a good name," he said, and went back to work. On the third night, cutting carefully through years of black overspray on the tank with fine sandpaper, Daniel found a layer of deep orange-red underneath, a shade he half recognized from old photographs the way you half recognize a song from before you were born. Working the way an archaeologist works, in thin passes, he found something else on the underside of the steering head, hidden from view once the bike was assembled, a hand-stamped mark, not a sticker, not a plate, pressed straight into the steel. A number, and beside it, a stylized set of initials. He photographed it and searched for 2.5 hours. Close to 1 in the morning, he found a match in a scanned-back issue of a defunct racing magazine from 1979. The article covered the sudden collapse of a small independent race team that had operated out of the Midwest through the early 70s, a team known, in a single throwaway sentence, for chassis innovations that had quietly reshaped how privateer race bikes were built for a decade afterward. The article mentioned that the team's entire shop, along with several prototype machines, had been lost in a warehouse collapse during a storm in the winter of 1979. One prototype in particular, a development mule built to test a radical new frame geometry, had never been recovered from the wreckage. It was presumed destroyed and had never surfaced since. The stamped initials belonged to a man named Otis Renner. The article named him as the team's chief frame builder. It also mentioned, in a single line near the bottom, that Renner had died in a track accident in 1978, a full year before the storm that supposedly took the prototype with it. The team had been founded and financed by a man named Julian Vance. Daniel sat in the garage until the light came up gray under the door. Nate hadn't meant to tell anyone. He told his wife, because 48 hours of sitting on something that size and saying nothing was more than a person could reasonably manage. His wife told a friend 2 streets over because it felt wrong to hold alone. That friend told her husband, who mentioned it to the man who walked his beagle past Daniel's house every morning. By the next day, Willow Street had reached that particular state where everyone knows the same thing and nobody says it out loud. 2 neighbors showed up at Daniel's garage with flimsy excuses. One wanted to borrow a tire gauge. One was checking on a cat. Both looked past him at the tarp-covered shape in the corner for as long as they decently could. Renee heard a version of the story that had passed through 4 people and picked up some rounding along the way. What she heard was that the junk bike Daniel had bought for $80 might be worth millions. She laughed when she heard it, said it sounded made up. Then she went inside and searched Julian Vance. She found photographs of a lean, white-haired man in his early 60s standing in front of a private collection at a charity auction and a profile in a business magazine that put his net worth somewhere north of $600 million, built from decades of motorsport consulting, a handful of early patents, and a private collection considered one of the finest of its kind. Near the bottom of the profile was a short paragraph noting that Vance had, for years, quietly funded searches for a single prototype from his early career, one he believed had been destroyed in a warehouse collapse decades earlier. Renee stood at her window looking at the blue tarp in Daniel's driveway for a long time. That afternoon she knocked on his door holding a bag of sugar she claimed to need. Daniel opened the door, listened, and said, "Don't have any." He closed it, not unkindly, just with the finality of someone who'd already decided how much of his evening he was willing to spend on this. She stood on the step a moment, then went home. That evening, an email landed in the inbox tied to Daniel's forum account. The sender was Priscilla Odom, listed in her signature as Executive Assistant, Office of Julian Vance. The message was brief. Her employer had seen the forum thread and the photographs. If Mr. Reyes did in fact have the machine in his possession, Mr. Vance would very much like to see it in person, at Mr. Reyes's convenience, as soon as could be arranged. Daniel read it 3 times at the kitchen table. Then he went out to the garage, sat on Mabel's bucket, and called Nate. "You up?" "It's 10:15. "What?" "Julian Vance's office just emailed me." A pause. "Say that again." He said it again. A longer pause this time. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know yet. Wanted to tell someone first." "You told the right guy," Nate said. "Now go tell her yes. You'll see them tomorrow." The next morning was a Sunday, which felt like either a coincidence or something closer to a pattern, depending how you looked at it. Daniel was up at 5:30 as always, made coffee, packed a lunch for Mabel out of pure habit even though there was no school, because the routine held the days together and he wasn't going to take it apart without a reason. He put on the one collared shirt he owned that didn't have an oil stain on it. He was aware, briefly, of how that decision looked. He wore it anyway. Mabel asked over cereal, "Is somebody important coming?" "Maybe." "Is Ember gonna stay?" He looked at his daughter for a second. "Let's see how the day goes." Nate arrived at 9 without being asked, because some things need a witness. He brought 2 coffees and the expression of a man who's placed a bet he isn't allowed to admit to. A dark blue sedan, the kind that costs more than most houses on the block, pulled to the curb at exactly 10. Down the street, behind her front window, Renee had been watching for 20 minutes, her tea long since gone cold. Julian Vance did not look like a man who was often caught off guard. 63, lean in the way of people who've stayed physical their whole lives, hands that had clearly done real work at some point despite the tailored jacket. He walked straight for the garage the moment he got out of the car, like he already knew exactly where he needed to be. Priscilla Odom followed a step behind, a folio under her arm. Nate hung near the door, present but not part of it. Vance circled the bike slowly, the same way Daniel had circled it at the salvage yard, hands extended, occasionally touching the tank, the frame, the case. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quiet and even. "I thought this was gone for good." He looked at Daniel directly for the first time. "You know what this is?" "I know what I found. I don't know what it is. I built the geometry for this frame." Otis built the actual thing. 1976. Took him the better part of 2 years, and it cost him more than the money we put into it. He turned back toward the bike. "In 79, I was told it went down with the shop in the storm. I believed it because there wasn't much else to believe at the time." He crouched at the steering head, found the stamped mark with his fingertips, and stayed there a full, silent minute. Otis died in the spring of 78. Never saw this thing finished. It never raced, not once. It was a test mule, built to prove a geometry theory he'd been chasing for years. He was right. It changed how privateer frames got built for the next decade, even though almost nobody knew where the idea came from. He stood. Otis put his mark on everything he built himself. Said a builder should sign his work same as a painter does. "What happened to it, if it didn't burn?" Daniel asked. Vance shook his head slowly. "Don't know. Somebody must have moved it before the storm, or it just wasn't in the building that night. I had people look for it twice over the years. Eventually I stopped." He looked up. "How'd you find it?" Daniel told him plainly, no embellishment. The salvage yard, the back row scheduled for the crusher, the shape of it that made him stop before he understood why. "Why'd you buy it?" Vance asked. "It looked like scrap from the outside." Daniel thought about that honestly. "I can't fully explain it. Something in the proportions. It didn't look like an accident. It looked like something somebody had thought about for a long, long time before they built it." Vance held his gaze. Otis used almost that exact sentence the first time he showed me his drawings. The garage went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something true has just been said and recognized by everyone in it. Mabel appeared in the doorway, Ember under one arm, holding onto the frame with the other, not quite committing to coming in. Daniel said, "Come here." She came and stood beside him. Vance looked down at her. She looked back at him, then at the bike, then back at him. "Dad named it Ember." "I mean, I did." Something moved across Vance's face, small but visible. "That's a good name," he said. Mabel considered this seriously. "Did you miss it a lot?" Vance was quiet a moment. "Very much." "That's what Dad says about stuff that matters," Mabel said. "That you miss it." Priscilla stepped forward and held the folio open toward Daniel. A single number on the top sheet, for $1 million. Below it, a one-page purchase agreement, plain and direct. I don't haggle over things like this, Vance said. That's the number, to me and to a museum both. You can say no. You don't have to answer today. Daniel looked at the number. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the bike one more time. The taper of the tank, the hand-laid weld, the cold steel under the shop lights. He didn't answer right away. That evening, after Vance and Priscilla had gone, Daniel sat alone in the garage for a long time. Mabel was inside watching a show. Nate had stayed an hour and then gone home, with the good sense not to push a conversation that hadn't started yet. Daniel thought about Priya. She'd kept a small sketchbook, mostly bikes, not technical drawings, just impressions, the way someone draws a thing they love without trying to engineer it. There was one shape she'd drawn over and over in slightly different versions, a long, low frame with a tank that tapered at an angle he'd never seen on anything in a showroom. He'd looked at that page 100 times without knowing what it was. He understood now that she might not have been drawing from memory. She might have been drawing something she'd only ever read about in an old magazine, imagining it into being. He thought about the name Mabel had picked without knowing any of this. The fox and the bike, landing on the same word through a 6-year-old's instinct, in a garage on Willow Street. He called Priscilla. I have one condition, he said. Then it's yes. Tell me. It goes on public display, not into a private collection, somewhere people can actually see it. And on the placard, there's a line that says it was found and identified by someone who saw value where everyone else saw scrap. You don't need my name on it. But Otis Renner's name goes on there clearly, and the engineering gets explained in plain language so a regular person understands what he actually did. I'll take that to Mr. Vance right away. 8 minutes later, she called back. He agrees to everything. He wants to add one more line. He wants your daughter's name on the placard too. He said the bike has a name now, and whoever gave it that name should be on record. Daniel put a hand over his eyes for a moment and sat like that in the quiet garage. Then he said, tell him thank you. The next morning, Renee came outside without her tea. Daniel noticed it from the kitchen window. The first time in over a year he could remember her stepping out without something in her hands. She stood at her fence as a flatbed backed carefully down the street. Daniel came out to oversee the load in, watching 2 technicians secure the bike to the ramp with a care that bordered on reverence. Renee crossed the street and stopped a few feet away. I didn't know. I couldn't have. Daniel looked at her. There was no triumph in it, nothing performed. It's all right, Renee. Next time you see somebody spend money on something they believe in, maybe give it a week before you say anything. She had no answer for that. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and let it go. Mabel came out onto the porch in her pajamas, still holding Ember, and watched the bike get strapped down. She raised one hand and gave a small, solemn wave. Daniel caught it out of the corner of his eye and felt his throat tighten in a way he hadn't expected. The payment landed 3 weeks later, a single transfer on a Wednesday. Daniel sat at the kitchen table looking at the number on his laptop screen without moving for a long while. The first thing he did was call the hospital about the balance still sitting from Priya's final week, paid it off in full, in a call that lasted under 4 minutes, and ended with him saying thank you and hanging up before anyone could say more. It wasn't triumph, the feeling that came after. It was more like a window opening in a room that had been shut too long, the air suddenly moving, the temperature suddenly different. He bought Mabel new shoes, the right size, in the style she'd pointed at through a store window months earlier without asking. He bought her a model kit of an old race bike. Thought maybe we could build one ourselves, he said. She looked at the box a long moment, then up at him. Together? Yeah, this weekend. He called Nate and told him he was putting money into the shop, not an investment with paperwork, just help between 2 people who trusted each other. Nate argued out of principle, then accepted, also out of principle. They agreed to add a second lift and take on an apprentice. The rest went into a scholarship fund at Mabel's school, named for Priya, quiet assistance for kids whose families were carrying weight that doesn't show up in a school photo. Daniel didn't attend the announcement. He sent a letter and declined to speak at it. 3 weeks after that, Priscilla called to invite Daniel and Mabel to the opening of a new gallery wing at the Regional Transportation Museum, dedicated to independent motorsport engineering. The centerpiece was the bike, fully restored to its 1976 finish, the deep orange red that Otis Renner had chosen because, according to a note found in his old shop ledger, he thought it was the color of something about to move faster than it should be allowed to. They drove up on a Thursday evening. Mabel wore her new shoes and carried Ember in the crook of her arm. Vance was already there, and he crouched down to Mabel's height before he even shook Daniel's hand. The bike sat under careful lighting on a low platform in the center of the room, visible from every angle. A thing imagined before its time, hidden for over 40 years, brought back into the light. Daniel read the placard slowly. Otis Renner's name was there, prominent. The engineering explained in plain terms that told the Rayall story, the years of work, the influence that had quietly rippled outward without anyone tracing it back to its source. Near the bottom, a line about the bike's recovery, found in a scrapyard by a man who noticed something in its proportions that everyone else had missed. And below that, smaller, named Ember by a 6-year-old named Mabel Reyes, who said it was the right name. It was. Mabel stood in front of the bike a long time, very still. Then, without turning around, she asked, "Dad, is Ember happy here?" Daniel stood behind her, looking at the machine. He thought about Otis Renner spending 2 years on something he believed in. He thought about 40 years under a collapsed tin roof. He thought about a 6-year-old on a bucket in a garage, listening for something in the shape of a thing. "I think so," he said. "More people get to see him now." Mabel nodded. "That's good." She reached up and took his hand. "Can we get food after? I want the kind with the dipping sauce." Daniel smiled. "The real kind. The kind that shows up before you've decided to let it." A few people nearby noticed, without quite knowing why it seemed worth noticing. "Yeah," he said. "Whatever you want." Back on Willow Street, a for sale sign went up on Renee's lawn before the end of the following month. The reason she gave the neighbors she still spoke to was a shorter commute to a new office. That much was even true. Nobody on the block said anything unkind about it out loud. The particular justice that ordinary life sometimes delivers isn't loud or dramatic. It's just the quiet weight of a sentence you said once, in front of people who were listening and can't take back. Daniel kept the garage, kept the radio on the shelf between the wrenches, kept the 5:30 mornings, the chalkboard calendar, the Sunday barbecue with Nate. He didn't become a different person. He became a steadier version of the one he'd already been. Someone who understood, with certainty now, that the things worth noticing rarely announce themselves, and that the line between scrap and something extraordinary is often nothing more than a willingness to stop and actually look at what the rest of the world has already walked past. Some nights he still talked to Priya in the garage, not out loud, in the way people do when they've loved someone completely and the conversation simply never really ended, just changed shape. He thought she would have known that bike for what it was the second she saw it. He thought she'd have gone straight to it in that scrapyard without hesitating, put her hand on the tank, and said, "I know this shape." He thought she'd have been proud of Mabel for the name, and proud of him for the $80. And